sure you will find him incredibly fascinating and thought-provoking. So I want to welcome Tony Iton.
Well, good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. It took me 5 hours to get here on the 101. So you really are isolated. So I'm curious to find out what is the big secret down here. What's being hidden? So maybe we can have that conversation a little bit. So I'm just going to tell you a story. It's a little bit of a long story. It involves me and it involves a lot of data. And I hope it'll help you get a sense of sort of how I come to some of the conclusions that I come to about what are some of the most important drivers of health in our society. So I'm just going to jump right into this. And hopefully you've got enough caffeine in you, because I like to start with a little bit of provocation, but hold on, I'll get there. So I like this quote from Rudolf Virchow, who says that physicians are the natural attorneys of the poor, and social problems fall to a large extent within their jurisdiction. Meaning that when you're in medicine, you're really not just dealing with the clinical science of managing physiology. You're really looking at, or should be looking at, the context that creates the disease that's in front of you, and you should be thinking about what is your role in trying to navigate and manage that context so that you see less disease. But this is one of my favorite quotes. And I don't know if you guys can read it, but I'll read it to you. I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. Does anybody know who said that? Anybody know who said that? I'm going to stand here until somebody says something. Dubois? No, that's an interesting suggestion, no? Abraham Lincoln. Why would you say that? But Abraham Lincoln is the great emancipator. Well, how would you explain that coming from Abraham Lincoln? He was a politician. So Abraham Lincoln said that in 1858 in the Lincoln-Douglas debates when he was running for the Senate, and he lost, despite having such a wonderful white supremacist platform. How many of you have been to the Lincoln Memorial? Okay, so everybody's been to the Lincoln Memorial, but nobody knew that Lincoln had said that. And at the Lincoln Memorial, his words are carved into like granite or whatever that is, marble, up on the walls. How come that other speech is not carved into granite up on the walls of the Lincoln Memorial? I mean, he said it. He said it publicly. He was asserting his position. That's a real question. I'm going to stand here until somebody answers it. He changed his mind. We changed his mind. That's interesting. It's not a pretty side of history. It's a product of his time. So why do we not carve those words into granite at the Lincoln Memorial? I mean, seriously, why don't we do it? Nobody wants to remember it. So we like to have a narrative, a story that we tell ourselves about who we are. And that narrative shapes policy. And policy creates real-world conditions for people. And so if you want to contend with those real-world conditions, you have to look at the policy. And if you want to change the policy, you have to understand the narrative that undergirds that policy. So that's the whole message of what I'm going to tell you about, I hope. Okay, so This leads me to this conversation about place, but before I talk about place, I want to talk about where I grew up. Does anybody recognize this? It's an island city. It's an old volcano. It sits in the middle of the river. It's got about 1 million people in it. Nothing? Nothing at all. Wow. You people really don't get out of San Luis Obispo, do you? Okay, it's not in this country. People don't speak English there. They speak French and English there. I think I heard it. Yes, Montreal. Yay. The veggie prize goes to whoever said that. So I grew up in Canada in the 70s and 80s, and Canada has a social contract with its citizens. It's got universal health care, it's got universal dental care, child care, highly subsidized post-secondary education. I went to McGill University in Montreal, which is called the Harvard of the North, basically for free. And it was strange for me in the mid-'80s when I came from Montreal to go to Johns Hopkins Medical School that I stumbled into this environment immediately outside of the walls of Johns Hopkins Medical School. I mean, literally, you walk outside the door, and this is what you see. And I was so shocked, because I didn't understand the US. I had never lived there. I was shocked when I walked out into this environment in this ostensibly first world country and saw this. So shocked that the guy that was touring me around, he said, "What's wrong with you?" And I said, "When was there a war here?" And I'll never forget what he said to me. He looked at me with this look of utter disdain, and he said, "What'd you expect? It's the inner city." And I said, "I'm supposed to expect this? This is normal for American cities?" And you've got a name for it. You call it inner cities. That's where you just put the people you don't care about? Is that how that works? Because you don't have these in Canada. And you've got huge cities in Canada, but you don't have these inner cities. And I go back to Baltimore all the time, and I wonder, what this kid is owed. He didn't create that environment, but he's got to navigate it every single day of his life. And that environment says to him, "You don't matter. You're not valued." And this is Abraham Lincoln's text speaking to this kid. And we know what happened in Baltimore, at least I hope we know what happened in Baltimore. Why is that not moving? Let's try this. There we go. We know what happened in Baltimore a few years later, and the people were so surprised by this, except for those of us who'd lived in Baltimore. We were like, what did you expect? It's the inner city. And Time magazine even asked the same question. They said, "What's changed?" Now I'm showing you this for a reason. How many of you have been to Baltimore, by the way? Oh my God. So nobody knows Montreal, but you've all been to Baltimore? You should go to Montreal. It's a nice place. It's beautiful. It's like a mixture of Paris, New York, and San Francisco. Okay, so, the American narrative is full of these inner cities. We've told this story before over and over again, and we just sort of wall it off and we say, yeah, that's an unfortunate occurrence of capitalism. But how many of you know this place? I think this thing is dead. I'm going to give you a few hints. This place is in America. It's in the middle of America. And it has a higher incidence of HIV than sub-Saharan Africa. It is 98% white. And it's an... Yes. Oh, okay. I gave it away. All right, so this is Scott County, Indiana. Does anybody know why Scott County, Indiana has been in the news lately? Other than what I just said. Yes. A big opioid outbreak, this drug called Opana, which people are grinding up and shooting and exchanging needles and getting HIV and hepatitis C. And Mike Pence, who is now the Republican vice presidential candidate is the governor of Indiana and oversaw this state during the time when this outbreak was occurring, and he refused to distribute clean needles until he basically had no choice and had to reverse himself. But the reason I'm showing you this is because this is the same thing as East Baltimore. This is exactly the same thing. The things that are driving this epidemic are the same things that are driving the insurrection that happened in Baltimore and Ferguson, Missouri, and elsewhere. This is income inequality in black and white. This is the lack of a social contract. So people don't have universal health care. They don't have a universal child care benefit. They don't have highly subsidized post-secondary education. They're contending with essentially the slow deterioration of the infrastructure that they need to be able to pursue the American dream. It's happening throughout this country. There's an evaporation of the structure, the opportunity structure that people need to be able to be successful, and that has a profound impact on their health. I'm just going to throw this out. This is not working at all. Okay. So the question for us is really, when it comes to your health, you may need a battery. When it comes to your health, does your zip code matter more than your genetic code? And I'm going to try to prove that to you with some data. So, as Joel mentioned, I became the health officer and health director in Alameda County. And for those of you who don't know where Alameda County is, that's San Francisco. And this big boot-like thing is Alameda County. And we like to say it's a boot that's trying to crush San Francisco. Now, when I became the health director there, one of the jobs of the health officer, is the health officer here, by the way? She's not here. Shucks.
We want her to be. She's actually in America.
Okay, well, text her and tell her to go visit East Baltimore. Because I would like to know, although we have some data on San Luis Obispo, I'd like to know what you guys are doing with your data. But when you're the health officer, you're the registrar of all births and deaths. And there are about 10,000 deaths in Alameda County every year. And I'm a total data junkie. I just love data. So having been in East Baltimore, when I came to Alameda County, I figured there was a story to be told in these death certificates. It was hidden in these thousands of death certificates, and I wanted to tell that story. So we put all these death certificates into a database. We had about 500,000 death certificates over about 55 years in a database. And on a death certificate, you can tell what somebody died of, what their age was when they died, their race, ethnicity, and where they lived. All right, we'll try. I can click it forward if it's... And those 4 pieces of data can actually paint a very compelling picture. Ooh, it's working now. Can paint a very compelling picture of what death looks like in a community. So the first thing that we did is we went back in time. We wanted to know, what life expectancy was for various groups of people in Alameda County over time. And the reason we did that was because at the time, Healthy People 2010 said the first goal, should I test this audience and find out what the first goal of Healthy People 2010 was? Anybody know? Number 1 goal of the nation's public health Bible? Okay, so my health department didn't know either. And the first goal is to increase life expectancy for all Americans. And then the second goal was to eliminate health disparities amongst various different groups of Americans. So we figured we needed to know what life expectancy was in Alameda County, so we calculated it with these death certificates. And to do that, you need the census. And the census only started talking about groups other than white and black in 1990. So if you wanted to go back before 1990, you could only talk about white, black, and other, which was a ridiculous catch-all category. So we just talk about white and black. And we found that in 1960, life expectancy difference between whites and blacks in Alameda County was 2.3 years. 20 years later, it had more than doubled to almost 5 years. And 45 years later, it had almost quadrupled to approaching 8 years. And this is during a time of revolutionary change in healthcare. With MRIs and pharmaceutical wonder drugs and minimally invasive surgery. And during this time, the gap widened. And I was health officer for part of this time, and I used to say to people, I should be fired. I mean, if we were really holding ourselves accountable in this community for health, and the number 1 goal of Healthy People 2000 is to increase life expectancy for all Americans. Actually, you could argue that we were meeting that goal. But the number 2 goal was to eliminate health disparities, and that health disparity, the profound health disparity, and life expectancy was growing, and it was growing measurably on my watch. But nobody ever held me accountable for that, so we had to hold ourselves accountable for it. So what we did is we took those death certificates and we mapped the entire county in every neighborhood, every census tract level, and we calculated, on average, how long somebody could expect to live in each of those neighborhoods. And we found in the city of Oakland, neighborhoods that were not very far apart, within a couple miles of each other, had a life expectancy difference of over 20 years. And that was pretty shocking. But it wasn't just Oakland. This ended up on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle. When I first started talking about these maps, people would say, oh my God, what's happening in Alameda County? That's a really inequitable place. And I was like, no, that's not the message. So we went around the country and started doing it in other places. This is Cleveland. We went back to Baltimore, which has neighborhoods with life expectancies of 58 years. LA, and ended up in the LA Times. This is Seattle. This is New York City, Philadelphia, Minneapolis, Boston. Everywhere we looked, everywhere, there was no exception. We found life expectancy differences on the order of 15, 20, 25 years in the same city. And there was no way to explain that based on access to health care or health behaviors. Something else was driving these differences. And, I say in public health, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, but you do have to be able to spot a pattern every now and then. And so when you look at these patterns, you have to have an explanation for these patterns. And quite frankly, we don't have a good explanation for these patterns. I mean, I think I do. But our conventional narrative is that health is about health care. And other than health care, it's about people behaving badly. So it's about personal responsibility. And if people took more personal responsibility and they had a good doctor, then they'll be healthy. And that's false. It's actually false. It's not even only part true, it's actually false. Okay, so we actually mapped the entire state of California. So we have San Luis Obispo in here somewhere. Don't ask me to point it out on a map, I couldn't do it. The other thing you could do with these maps, which we did if you're a data junkie, who are the epidemiologists here? Any epidemiologists? Okay, well I have to look at the data junkies when I'm doing this because, you guys get me. So data junkies will look at this and say, wow, potential for a bivariate correlation, and get really excited about it. So just letting you know that's what's happening. So this is what we did. You take the map of life expectancy, which is at the census tract level, and the map of poverty, which you get from the census, which is also at the census tract level. So for every census tract, you have a life expectancy and a poverty level, and you can correlate those two things. And you get life expectancy on the up axis. So as you go up, you're longer life expectancy communities, and as you move from left to right, you're going from wealthier to poorer communities. And so each of those blue dots is a neighborhood in Alameda County. And in an ideal world, this would be a completely flat line. How poor your neighborhood is shouldn't predict how long you live. But we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a world where there's a cost to living in a poor neighborhood, and you can measure that cost in length of life. This is a death tax that people pay as a result of living in poor communities. And trying to understand what creates the slope of that line. Because when you look around the country, you see this line in different places has a different steepness, a different slope. And the steeper that line, the more inequitable, at least as far as it comes to health, the more inequitable that society is. So we did the line for the entirety of the San Francisco Bay Area. We did the entire state of California. Unfortunately, you can't put this kind of stuff in the newspaper, so we had to translate the slope of that line. We had to monetize it. And for the San Francisco Bay Area, $12,500. Each additional $12,500 buys you a year of life. So that's the cost of human life in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I would encourage people when they're negotiating their raises with their bosses to bring this kind of data to the table. It's like, hey boss, I need a couple years, I've been working hard, I got that report to you on time. It's like, Tony, I don't know, man, that report was pretty bad. I'm seeing 6 months for you tops. And so then this question came up when I started doing these presentations. I mean, like I tell you, this is a story, and my whole life story is in slides. I mean, this is what I do. I literally carry it around in my pocket. Somebody says something interesting to me, I'm like, I need to make a slide about that. So people used to come up to me and say, well, Tony, you're a Canadian, you don't understand. America is a very generous country. We reach out to all these immigrants and we bring them, to our shores, tired, poor, huddled masses. And those immigrants are really sick. And, their health brings down our average. And therefore, and over time as they become more like us, they get healthier. And so you really shouldn't be comparing us to any other country in the world because we're unique, we're exceptional. It's like an apples to oranges comparison. I was like, that's a challenge. I got to make some slides. Okay, so we all know that you've probably all seen this graph at some point in your life. This is looking at per capita spending across developed countries on healthcare. And we all know the US spends way more than everybody else, twice the so-called OECD average. So whenever you make this graph and you include the US, you have to actually change the axis to fit the US on the graph with the rest of the world. And that's somewhat interesting. We know that for what we spend, we should get much better returns in life expectancy, and we don't. So we spend a lot, and we don't get a lot. That's interesting, but not the most interesting thing. This is much more interesting to me. This was a couple of women at Yale and Harvard, Lauren Taylor and Elizabeth Bradley, who were health services researchers, or are health services researchers, and they did this interesting thing where they looked at that old graph that we all look at, which is per capita spending on healthcare, which is the blue data that you see there. But then they added in per capita spending on social services or social benefits across developed countries. And when you do that, the US is no longer an outlier. The US is actually smack dab in the middle of the pack. So they're measuring what we spend on healthcare per person and then adding in what we spend on social services or social benefits per person. And what they found is that those countries that spend more on social benefits than they do on healthcare have better health. The ratio of social benefit spending to health spending actually predicts health. So we literally have the accent on the wrong syllable in this country. We're spending it all downstream after the fact, and the countries that have good health are spending it upstream before the fact. So it's not like the data is not there. We're comparing ourselves literally to everybody in the world that we can compare ourselves to, and we come up short. The other thing I had to do, because people told me that, well, it's because of all the brown people that were not healthy, is looking at just white Americans, the health status of white Americans. And US white life expectancy is about 79 years, which is about that of Qatar, Costa Rica, and Nauru. Anybody know where Nauru is? You know everything, don't you? Very good. Boy, this is an education. So you don't know Montreal, but you know Nauru. Boy, I'm insulted. Okay, so US whites are living shorter lives than Belgium, Chile, Denmark, Lebanon, Slovenia, Austria, Finland, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Malta, the Netherlands, Portugal, UK, Canada, of course, Cyprus, France, Iceland, Israel, South Korea, Luxembourg, Monaco, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, Andorra, Australia, Italy, San Marino, Singapore, Spain, Switzerland, and Japan. That's 33 countries in the world that have longer life expectancies than US whites. In 1990, there were only 17. US white life expectancy is plummeting compared to the rest of the world. Plummeting. I mean, it's really it's unprecedented. In fact, the Institute of Medicine put out this report a couple of years ago called Shorter Lives, Poorer Health. And it was comparing US health in general to the rest of the world. And this was their conclusion, and this is the IOM. They don't get emotional about anything. This is basically them screaming pulling their hair off. The panel was struck by the gravity of its findings. Struck by the gravity of its findings. For many years, Americans have been dying at younger ages than people in almost all other high-income countries. This disadvantage has been getting worse for 3 decades, especially among women. The US health disadvantage cannot be fully explained by the health disparities that exist among people who are uninsured or poor, as important as those issues are. Several studies are now suggesting that even advantaged Americans, those who are white, insured, college-educated, or upper income, are in worse health than similar individuals in other countries. Hopefully some of you have seen this data from Ann Case and Angus Deaton at Princeton. They just won a Nobel Prize for it. And they were talking about white working class mortality rates, which have been plummeting. I'll show you the graphic. They looked at mortality rates for populations all around the world and compared them to US whites in that red line there. Whereas mortality rates are dropping, it's good for mortality rates to drop. Mortality rates, you want low ones. US white mortality rates are growing at a time when the rest of the world is dropping, including African Americans and Latinos. So US white life expectancy and health status is not good. It's bad. In fact, when we look at health disparities, we should not be comparing low-income people of color to white people, because the white standard is not a very high standard. We should actually be comparing low-income people to immigrant Latinos, at least when it comes to life expectancy, because they actually have higher life expectancy than anybody in the United States. And as they acculturate, as they become more American, their life expectancy drops. America is not good for your health. That's a laugh line. You're supposed to laugh at that. It's not a cry line. So the California Endowment, we've been trying to tell people this. We're trying to change the paradigm through which people understand health, because we still default to health care, access to health care, bad personal behaviors. And those things are true, they're just not sufficient. There's a much broader context that shapes our health, over which we have enormous control. We have just, for whatever reason, decided not to exercise control over that. So these are real zip codes in California, real life expectancies. These are real zip codes and real high school graduation rates. When Sacramento built its new airport terminal, we decided we were going to have a conversation with the legislators, on the walls of that terminal. And we know that they saw it because they started calling me and asking me why I was depressing property values in their districts. At the American Public Health Association meeting in San Francisco a few years ago, we literally festooned downtown San Francisco with this message. And then the governor let us put up this huge billboard outside his office for like 4 months a couple of years ago. I don't know why, but he let us do it. And then it was great because we got so much press and attention to this issue. So we know that 80%, and I think Joel said this, or maybe Jim said this, 80% of what affects our life and our health happens outside the doctor's office. It happens outside the medical model. And what happens in these low life expectancy communities that I showed you on those maps, and then increasingly, really in America's heartland, where white working class mortality is plummeting, and people are dying from things like poisonings, overdoses, suicides. These are so-called deaths of despair. These are people who don't see a future. They don't have the reach, any grasp at the lowest rung of the ladder to pull themselves up towards the American dream. This is people are losing hope in these places. And I would argue it's because we don't have a social compact. We don't have some basic fundamental infrastructure that allows people to get ahead. In some of the places that we're working in California, including in the eastern Coachella Valley and South Kern County in the northernmost part of the state, Del Norte, the schools are bad, housing is bad, there's no transportation systems, there are very few jobs, people can't get access to health care, there's crime. In some of the urban areas, they're policed like militarized zones. They don't have access to healthy food. They don't have access to parks. In some cases, they don't have access to safe drinking water. All of these things are conspiring against them in one place. Like literally every system is on life support. And then we tell them with a brochure, eat well, exercise, and see your doctor. I mean, it's absurd. They're living in these surreal environments that are conspiring against them at every turn. And we're talking about children now who are experiencing this, for 20, 30 years of their lives, they're experiencing these environments. And we're handing them a pamphlet saying, brush your teeth or something like that. Literally. So what happens in these places, people basically are bathed in cortisol. It's a chronic stress reaction, this whole notion of allostatic load. And what we've seen is that chronic stress not only changes your physiology, and I'll show you how that works. The body interprets the stressor through the brain, which sends a message to the pituitary gland, which sends a message to the adrenal glands, which releases cortisol in a cascade of hormones. And cortisol has profound effects on you. In the short term, it's good for you. It's sort of part of the fight or flight response. It stimulates your cardiac output. It rallies glucose for your muscles in case you've got to throw a punch or run. It stimulates your immune system. It brings down your inflammatory system, and it stimulates the growth of neurons in the part of your brain that are responsible for what's called executive function. Executive function, simply put, is basically the ability to choose between short-term, intermediate-term, and long-term options, to make a rational choice across a long kind of timeline. But in the red, when you're constantly awash in cortisol, which is what happens to people living in these environments that are conspiring against them, and children in particular, who are looking around at these environments and recognizing that the message from this environment is that you don't matter, you're not valued. They internalize that. And cortisol is constantly circulating in their bodies, and it changes their physiology. And it doesn't only change their physiology, it actually changes their behavior. Chronic stress makes you crave high fat, high salt, high sugar foods. It doesn't only change your behavior, it actually changes how your genes express themselves. It causes methylation of your DNA and can actually not only change your DNA, but that can be passed on. Believe it or not, it can be passed on to your children. So the policies that we're creating are creating disease, and that disease is leading to premature death. So when you see health disparities, you're really only seeing the tip of the iceberg. You're not seeing the inequities underneath that, or at least you're not looking generally for the inequities underneath that.
What determines how long we'll live? Is it what we do? Is it who we are? Actually, when it comes to predicting how long you'll live, your zip code is more important than your genetic code. Here's how this works. Meet Deb and Maria. They both have jobs, they're around the same age, they're both married, and they both have 2 kids. Deb lives in A-Town, while Maria lives in B-ville, less than 1 mile away. They're similar in so many ways, but here's the thing. On average, residents of B-ville will die more than 15 years sooner than the residents of A-Town. Why? Because where you live is about more than just your address. It's about your opportunities. For example, Deb and Maria's access to healthy options is really different. In A-Town, Deb's family is surrounded by healthy food options, including farmers markets, specialty shops, and grocery stores. The air in A-Town is cleaner and fresher, and there are lots of safe, clean parks where Deb can exercise and her children can play. A-Town has good public schools for Deb's kids and easy access to emergency and preventive health care. On the other hand, B-ville has broken, badly lit sidewalks, and the parks are unsafe. The air is filled with truck exhausts from the nearby highway. And for food options, Maria's only choices are B-ville's many liquor stores, fast food places, or convenience stores. The schools in B-ville are overcrowded and undersupported. And even if Maria can get her kids into better schools far away, she needs to figure out how to get them there without access to a car. So for Maria, having to juggle so much to find healthy options can be an overwhelming source of chronic stress, which is a serious health risk factor. In fact, for all the residents of B-ville, chronic stress drives health problems like obesity, diabetes, asthma, and heart disease. How did A-Town and B-ville get so different? Well, in many cases in cities and towns across California, the root cause was racial and economic discrimination. Over the generations, poor white people and people of color were pushed to less desirable parts of town. Where banks refused to lend money, businesses left, jobs too. Schools declined, and the neighborhood crumbled. Everyone who could move away did. And what's more, when communities like Iton and Beeville are so unequal, Beeville isn't the only one that suffers. Because it turns out that not only is your zip code a predictor of how long you'll live, so is what country you live in. Countries with the greatest income inequality have the lowest life expectancy. So even Americans like Deb, who are white, insured, college-educated, and upper income, die younger than their peers in other countries. In fact, our life expectancy is 43rd in the world, and that number is slipping. In the end, our biggest health risk may actually be inequality, and extreme inequality hurts us all. So what do we do? Well, if we're all going to be healthier, we don't just need to help the folks in Beeville beat the odds. We need to change the odds for everyone. And that's what we're doing. There's a movement happening. We're Californians. We don't follow. We lead. We are building the power to make health happen in communities across the state. We are coming together to build one California, a smarter, more inclusive and equitable state that creates health and opportunity for all of us. Join us. To learn more, visit buildinghealthycommunities.org.
Okay, hopefully some of you recognized the narrator in that. It's Mr. Sulu. No Trekkies here? All right. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, then I'm going to conclude, and hopefully we can have some questions and answers. And hopefully we can have some questions and answers. So I want to talk about just a way of trying to understand sort of how to design interventions to try to change some of this. Years ago, in the Bay Area, there was a group of 9 Bay Area health departments that came together out of frustration because we felt like the tools that we had at our disposal in our public health departments were inadequate to the task of the challenges that we were facing, that there were all these structural issues around transportation and housing and education and access to jobs that, you know, our public health tools just weren't a match for. And we wanted to figure out a different kind of practice, a way of being relevant to these larger challenges that were having such a potent impact on people's health. So we created this framework. It's called the BARHI framework, which stands for the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative. And it starts with the medical model. You read it from the right to the left. And it starts with this sort of data observation that we have these communities that have high premature mortality rates. And when you look at those communities, you recognize that there is a higher burden of disease in those communities. And the medical model argues that that's driven by risk. Risk typically in the form of risk behaviors, which are smoking, drinking, not wearing a seatbelt, having unprotected sex, etc. And risk factors, which are, you know, genetic, things that people have no control over. They're just different. And so we spend a lot of money in the medical model on healthcare access, trying to change what people know and trying to tinker with their genetics, although that literally never works. And that's a $3 trillion enterprise. And what we argued in developing the BARHI framework was that, yes, that is true. It's not only true, it's necessary. It's just not sufficient. And that there's all of this other upstream opportunity in the so-called socio-ecological context, which Jim was referring to, that we can actually design interventions and be relevant in that space. So we talked about social inequities, which are sort of the conditions, the East Baltimores and the East Oaklands, and I don't know in San Luis Obispo whether you have these pockets. I'm assuming you have these pockets of inequity with farm workers and other kinds of people, but I'll wait to hear from you about that. But those places are not natural. They weren't created sort of by the people who live there. They were created usually by neglect. It's usually by the absence of policy in the face of abject need. And so we need to look at the institutions that sort of create the infrastructure for a community and allocate resources. And those resources may be things like parks and grocery stores. We're not talking about, esoteric things. We're talking about basic fundamental things that we all know that people need to be healthy. Kids need places, safe places to run around. People need access to healthy food that's affordable. So as a society, we need to try to create those things. We don't just say, hey, individual responsibility. It's your fault if you don't have grocery stores. And then we have to look at the narrative that essentially sets this notion of value. Who matters? Undocumented farm workers are not entitled to health care. Why? They literally put the food on our table. And we say that they're not entitled to health care. They're here feeding us. And we say they're not entitled to health care. What is the narrative there? What are we saying about that population? Because that creates policies, that creates real-world conditions for people. So the world of health disparities lives downstream. The world of health inequities lives upstream. If you're simple-minded like me, you can just take health out of the equation and talk about inequities producing disparities, or if you're really simple-minded like me, you talk about conditions producing consequences. And we spend $3 trillion a year in this country on consequence management or damage control. And what we're arguing is that we need to start thinking about what do we invest upstream intentionally in an organized way. Just like Jim was describing, that's an intentional set of practices in the socio-ecological context to try to take the demand off the downstream healthcare systems. You can take the health consequences out of this equation, just start talking about other consequences like educational attainment with essentially school absence leading to grade failure, leading to dropout. The upstream drivers remain the same. So we're arguing, let's figure out how we, in an organized way as a society, figure out how to make structured investments upstream that we know will reduce downstream disease. And I'll put it to you that this is what Canada and most Western democracies do. They make structured, intentional investments upstream in social benefits and services to essentially offload the downstream system. We ignore the opportunity to make those investments, and we pay a huge price downstream. So we've developed a practice, we call it about narrative, policy, and place, and one of the critical things is this arc of power. We think it's really critical amongst the people who are most impacted by inequity to invest in building social, political, and economic power and a critical mass of those people so that they can actively hold the systems that serve them accountable for more equity. This isn't about smarty pants people with a lot of degrees behind their names like me coming in and telling people what to do. This is about people setting their own agenda and prioritizing the things that matter to them in their lives. We need to facilitate that. This is really about optimizing democracy, as fanciful as that sounds. This is really about giving people meaningful voice. So very simply, the medical model says that bad behavior produces disease, produces premature death. And the socio-ecological model says that there are a set of bad societal behaviors, Abraham Lincoln notwithstanding. There are all of these narratives out there, and you see this manifesting itself just beautifully. I don't even have to say this. I should put Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton up here. You see this narrative in the presidential debate. It's about others. It's about lock us down, close the borders, deport people, don't let in, people with different religions. It's really about a narrative of exclusion, and that narrative of exclusion leads to a set of policies, and those policies create real-world conditions. And we need a new narrative, one that's inclusive in health, that actually invests in people and recognizes that we're all in this together, and that if we don't invest in people, we pay a big cost downstream, a preventable cost. So a set of bad societal behaviors that creates policies and practices that creates communities that are on life support. So We have interventions to try to prevent death. We call them emergency rooms. Interventions to try to change the course of disease. We call that 15-minute visits in clinical spaces. We have interventions to try to change behavior. We call that health education. We don't have, although from what Jim was describing and Joel was describing this morning, it sounds like San Luis Obispo has thought this through. Interventions to try to address the conditions in communities that are conspiring against people's health. We call ours about building power and leadership amongst people living in those places. We think that we need to invest in the indigenous populations in those places, not in doctors and again, academics, but actually in those people. But we don't think that that's sufficient. We think that we actually have to work on the policies and the practices to bring across these silos. The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker have to come together to make a meal. And we have health, we have education, we have law enforcement, we have all of these silos that are working in parallel. We want to bring them together and foster a common dialogue over time. And it sounds like you're doing that exactly with your coalition here. And finally, we think we have to change the narrative. And we have to start talking about health in different ways so people understand that health is not just about health care and personal responsibility. Although those things matter and they're necessary, they're just not sufficient. We call that the drivers of change. And so let me tell you a little bit about building healthy communities. So I got hired, I never liked philanthropy. I always thought philanthropy was sort of dilettantish and obnoxious. People who thought that they were smarter than everybody else. And I was a government guy, I worked in public health and I was on the front lines, putting out outbreaks of tuberculosis or, pertussis or what have you. And these fancy little California endowment people and wellness foundation people would come prancing around and sprinkle a few dollars here and say, here, come do what we think. And I was like, get the hell out of here, you don't know what you're doing. And then my boss, Bob Ross, is the CEO of the California Endowment, who's a pediatrician, came to me and he had a face-to-face conversation. He said, Tony, I don't like philanthropy either, but we're trying to do something different. We're trying to actually make a measurable difference in the health status of Californians. And we're not really sure how to go about it, so we're going to be trying to figure out how to do this as we go. And we're going to put $1 billion into it over 10 years. And he said, I'd like you to come and help us design it. And I said, no. And he came back 2 years later and he asked me the same question. And at that point, the county's budget was in the tank and we were cutting things right, left, and center. And I said, maybe. But I'll only do this if we can talk about power, if we can talk about racism, if we can talk about sexism, if we can talk about the drivers and the narratives that are creating the status quo conditions. And he said, sure. And so I came over and we basically designed this thing from scratch, not because we thought we knew better than anybody else, but because when we looked around, there weren't any models for doing this sort of place-based, deep, multi-issue health improvement initiatives over time that actually was focused on the social determinants of health. There were a lot of things that were focused on increasing access to health care and various other approaches, but nothing based on focusing on the social determinants of health. So we designed this thing from scratch, and the only caveat was that we'd spend $1 billion, 10 years, 14 places. We'd try to make a measurable change in the health status of populations, but we would not spend a nickel on health care because health care is already heavily overinvested. So that's what building healthy communities is. It's basically taking this model and trying to apply it in 14 places and then through a statewide umbrella function across the state. And it's basically about building social, political, and economic power and a critical mass of people in places like South Los Angeles, East Oakland, South Sacramento, North Richmond, Del Norte County, down to the City Heights in San Diego and various parts of the Central Valley. And it's also about policies, trying to create health in all policies and much more inclusive and sustainable policies and practices in communities. And then finally, it's about changing the narrative, which is what that animated video is about and all the posters we throw up on buildings and in airports and in the governor's office. It's trying to get people to think about health in a different way. And we're not alone. I mean, $1 billion is like a drop in the bucket when it comes to health in California, because what you're doing here, what people are doing in other counties and other cities, we're trying to align with that so that there's a consistent message. We share all of our materials. People are free to use them and use them in their own campaigns. And our goal is really to create a network across the state of people who are like-minded, working together on using examples of promising practices locally that can filter up to the state to lead to policy change. Now, we're halfway through this thing, and I'll tell you what's changed, and we think that we contributed substantially to it. Well, first of all, there's 5 million newly insured Californians. We invested a lot of money in trying to make sure that every county had outreach and enrollment resources to be able to bring people into Medi-Cal. And we were literally the most successful state in the country on that issue. We have about 1 million people that are now eligible to reclassify their felonies into misdemeanors because they were relatively low-level felonies, and Prop 47, which we helped create the environment for, passed and allows people with certain types of felonies to reclassify as misdemeanors and now be eligible for housing, not having to check the box on job applications, et cetera. The thing that I'm most proud of is when we first designed this thing, it was a health initiative, broadly conceptualized. But we went to our partner communities and we said, this is what we'd like to work on. And they said, looks good, but you're missing something, which is schools and kids, and the fact that our kids are being pushed into the school-to-prison pipeline. And we said, literally for 2 years we said this, we said, no, that's not health. And they kept coming back to us, and we finally said, okay, we'll take a look at this issue. And it turns out they were right, we were wrong. That this school push-out issue, at the time, there were about 800,000 suspensions and expulsions in California schools across the state, and a little bit more than 400,000 kids that were being suspended and expelled. And this was we know that one suspension after 9th grade makes it 30% less likely that you'll graduate from high school. And we also came to know that many of the kids living in these communities that are bereft of all of the infrastructure that's necessary for people to be able to have a shot at navigating a healthy life, these kids are traumatized, and they bring that trauma into the classroom. And when you're traumatized, this would happen to any of us. If you're awash in cortisol, you have no control over what's happening to you, you're witnessing violence, you bring this into the classroom, you act out, and you get suspended. You get pushed into a highly criminalized system now. School discipline is highly criminalized, with school resource officers on campus making arrests, issuing tickets, forcing parents to come to court. So the social and emotional health of children in the school system is a health issue. So we got involved in that, and over a process of a couple of years, managed to drive down suspensions in California by over 100,000. And in some of our sites, they've plummeted to near zero. And we're continuing to see decreases across the state. And this is why, and at the same time, when Texas is going up, Florida is going up, other big states are not seeing any change, California's are plummeting. They've gone down 40% over the past 3 years. So we're really proud of that for 2 reasons. One, we know that this directly correlates to people's educational attainment, which directly correlates to their health status later in life. We also know that because we got involved in this issue, we've seen real change, and it's measurable change. So we're halfway through building healthy communities. The benefits, we think, are many, and they're not just in the 14 sites. We're seeing policy change at the state level that's impacting school districts and healthcare and neighborhoods throughout the state. It's a lot of fun work, and we recognize that we're not in this alone at all. So with that, I'd love to take any questions, and like I always say, I like the provocative, obnoxious questions. I mean, you can ask nice ones, but I learned from the questions. I'll probably make some slides if I have some really obnoxious ones. So thank you very much for having me here today.